Sweet, steamy goodness. Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance, and I hope you are too. I have been so excited to make this video because I had an amazing reading month in October. Now, you may or may not have noticed that I did not do a mid-month wrap-up, and I have said before that, oh, I'll never do that again. I'll never skip a mid-month wrap-up because it's just too hard to remember all the details I want to talk to you about. But by the time October 15th came around, I had only finished 2 books. And there's a reason for that. There's a couple of reasons for that, and I'm going to get into it. I have more than 2 books to talk to you about today, so no worries there. But October was a really, really busy month for a couple of different reasons, and I want to talk to you about them. So I don't know if any of you follow baseball. Of course, the World Series is happening right now. My husband and I are really big baseball fans, and of course, the playoffs were in October, and there were 2 teams that we both really, really disliked that were in the playoffs. And the fact that we didn't like them, and on top of the fact that they have been to the World Series multiple times, we were just really, really rooting for the other teams. And in case you're wondering, we both dislike the Astros because of the history of the cheating. I know it just happened with one season, allegedly, and everybody that was involved in that is no longer on that team. It just still leaves a little bad taste in my mouth. And then we both really dislike the Phillies. Phillies fans have a reputation of not being really great fans. If you guys are Philly fans out there, I'm really sorry, nothing personal, but anyways, we just were really rooting against the Phillies. And we were just watching every game with bated breath, and we were just so overjoyed that neither one of those teams are at the World Series. And now we're really just enjoying watching the World Series. We're both rooting for the Rangers because they've never won a World Series before, so go Rangers. The next thing that took up a lot of my time in October, I wanted to share with you because remember this book that I read a couple of months ago? It's kind of a little picture book, but it also has information. It's called Ugly Cute, and it's about less frequently talked about animals because they don't have the traditional cuteness about them. Think of elephant seals, armadillos, wombats, things of that nature. But as you can see on the cover, there's this little thing called an axolotl salamander. That's what drew me to the book. I've never seen such a creature. I'd never heard of such a creature. And ever since learning about this axolotl a couple of months ago, I started seeing it everywhere, online, on TV, in movies, in books. If you remember when I talked about Catherine Chidgey's pet, I told you that there was like a class pet that was an axolotl salamander. And I'm like, what is happening? I was seeing it everywhere. And then I watch a lot of knitting channels because I'm an avid knitter, and there's a style of crochet called Amigurumi. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a crochet little plushie toy. And I've always loved plushies made out of crocheted fabric more than knit fabric plushie toys. For whatever reason, they're just so stinking cute, and you just can't replicate it with knitting. And the only thing keeping me from making amigurumi was that I just didn't want to learn how to crochet until I saw somebody had created a pattern for an axolotl salamander amigurumi. And without further blather, I learned how to crochet solely so that I can make this guy. Look at how cute he is. Look at him. Look at his little fronds. Look at his little tails. Look at his feet. Look at his little lips. And I loved him. So that took some time. Can you see him? Oh, good. He's going to be in all future videos. And finally, the last thing that kind of took up our time was we got hooked in that show, The Fall of the House of Usher. If you haven't watched it yet and you like kind of horror shows, it is fantastic. He did a brilliant job of the show, and it's the same guy who made Midnight Mass, which we also watch, which is outstanding, and he's made a couple of other things, and he's just brilliant. If you're looking for a good show to watch and you don't mind a little bit of scariness, both those shows I highly, highly recommend. Okay, I guess that's about as much life update as you probably can stand. Did everybody have a good Halloween? For those of you that celebrate, I hope you all had a fun night. Did any of you dress up? I actually dressed up for the first time in a long time just because I work in a bookstore and we all decided to dress up. and I will pop up a picture of how I dressed up. I had such a fun time. So many people commented on it. Very, very popular television character. If you have not watched the Ted Lasso show, you are missing out. It's one of the best shows that was on TV. There's 3 seasons. Highly, highly recommend it. It's a feel-good show, but it's also laugh out loud funny, and it's a show that I could watch over and over again. And anyways, I chose Ted Lasso as my costume this year, and I had a great time. Okay, and one last piece of admin before I get down to the books is I wanted to express my gratitude to all of you who gave me encouraging comments on a couple of videos where I was a little bit down on myself, a little bit discouraged about filming and about Booktube. You all were just so sweet and so kind and so encouraging, and it really did the trick. I just am so thankful for you taking the time to send me your love. It really means a lot to me, so thank you so much. Okay, a little bit of stats. I read 5 regular length books. I read 1 picture book, and I had 1 DNF. There were 5 women authors and 1 woman of color author. And other than the DNF, there was only 1 book that I didn't really care for. I mean, and it wasn't that I disliked it, it just wasn't, it was just a meh for me. The rest of the books I absolutely loved, and I have been so excited to talk to you about them. For those of you that watched my video of my October hopefuls, the spooky books that I had on my physical shelves that I kind of drew from and really wanted to get to in October, remember that big old stack? I did get to exactly 2 of them. Thank goodness for audiobooks, because I actually was able to read 3 spooky books for the month of October. In my defense, the 2 physical books that I went for, that I was able to finish, had the longest page count. So if that gives you any hint of what I read. Let me talk to you about my DNF first. So the book that I DNF'd in October was Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. Now let me tell you a little story about this book. It's not a long one. I listened to another booktuber talk about this book, and I won't say which booktuber it is, but I love the way she talks about books. And sometimes when somebody talks up a book so well, it doesn't matter if it's even a book that you would normally pick up. I mean, that's why we watch Booktube. She talked about this book, and she did say it was a romance, and I don't typically pick up romances, but there have been a romance or 2 in my history that I've enjoyed. So I thought, why not? She loved this book so much. And here's another thing. This is the cover that I first saw for Magnolia Parks. And it's an interesting cover, and it's not your average romance cover, right? I thought, okay, sure. And I decided to listen to it. When I pulled it up in my audio app, this is the cover that came up. And I thought, what is this? I don't think I would ever be interested in a book that had this cover. And it kind of set me back, and it might have ruined my experience. I don't know. No, it didn't. And here's why. Magnolia Parks is about a woman named Magnolia Parks, and she comes from obscene wealth and high society in, I believe, London or somewhere in England. And she's had this long-term relationship, on again, off again, with a man who's also from obscene wealth and high society named BJ. Of all names. I listened to 10% of this book, and all it really was talking about was how toxic the relationship was, how she is absolutely in love with BJ and he's the person for her, but he keeps cheating on her. I mean, like every other week, he cheats on her and then goes back to her, and she takes him back because she knows they're supposed to be together. Maybe the timing's not right, and back and forth and back and forth. And it was just so pointless. And then on top of that, anytime any character entered the scene, whoever was narrating from at that point would describe from head to toe what that person was wearing. And not only that, but the color, the fabric, and the brand, because it was usually some high-end brand like Dior and Ferragamo, and all of the brands. It was just so tedious and stupid. And the way this book was structured it was alternating perspectives. I don't know if they had any other perspectives. I didn't listen that long, but it was alternating between Magnolia and BJ. I listened to probably 2 chapters for each perspective, and it started off with Magnolia's perspective, And she talked about how BJ cheated on her. It was the worst day of her life. And then I thought, well, maybe there's something else that we don't know about yet, and we're going to find out when we listen to BJ's side of the story. Nope. BJ says, yeah, I cheat on her. I don't know why. I can't help myself, but she's the love of my life. Do you even know what the love of your life means? So yeah, I couldn't do it. And even to the point where I looked up the summary of Magnolia Parks, even if it was going to spoil it for me, and say, is there something that's going to happen down the line that makes all of this just, I don't know, make sense or make it worth reading through? And no, the entire book is just going back and forth and them getting together and breaking up and getting together and breaking up. Oh, what a waste of time. But oh well, yeah. So Magnolia Parks, unfortunately, was a DNF. And oh my God, and I found out it's a series. Like it goes on for multiple books. Oh, kill me now. The next book I read was Killing Me by Michelle Gagnon. I'm pretty sure I discussed this in a previous video for new releases that I'm excited about for May. And if any of you got this book and read it because I suggested it and it was a book that I was excited about, I'm sorry. I mean, I hope you enjoyed it more than I did. I enjoyed it okay. It was, well, let's talk about it. So Killing Me follows Amber, and she is a young woman, and the book opens with her being kidnapped. And she is taken to some basement, some room, and it becomes very clear to the reader and to Amber that she's about to be murdered. And then enters this masked woman who judo chops the bad guy and rescues Amber. Amber doesn't know why or who this woman is, and she tries to find out, and the woman is very tight-lipped and just wants to leave and doesn't want to have anything else to do with Amber. And so Amber leaves the scene before the police arrive because she doesn't want to have to answer questions because of things that have happened in Amber's past. Once the police come knocking on her door because they figure out that she's involved with this somehow, Amber leaves town. She drives to Las Vegas, of all places, and she ends up staying at this motel and befriending the hotel manager and befriending a local prostitute. She discovers that some serial killer has followed her there and is after her specifically now. And the story goes from there. The problems that I had with this story, first of all, being an audiobook, I don't know if I would have read into this tone if I would have read the physical copy, but the way the narrator narrated Amber as just very sarcastic, and I don't mind sarcasm. I use it quite often myself, but when every single utterance is dripping with sarcasm or attitude, it's too much. Especially when she's in the middle of being kidnapped and on the brink of being murdered, and she's being snarky and sarcastic. That's just so unrealistic, and it just built from there. The things that happened in this story were very unrealistic, and I don't mind suspending my disbelief when reading certain stories, but there's got to be some cutoff somewhere. And it was just improbability after illogical, after silly thing after another. There was a little bit of a twist, but at that point, I was rolling my eyes too far back up into my head to enjoy it. It had a good premise, but I don't think it was executed very well. Yeah, Amber was a little on the annoying side. Some of the side characters were fun, but they just didn't factor in enough to make a difference. If you like kind of a madcap, zany murder mystery, you might enjoy this, but it was a little bit of a disappointment for me. I think I expected a little bit more seriousness to it. Next, I want to talk to you about the picture book that I read. We had an event, which we often do at the bookstore that I work at, and we have authors come in and do signings or readings or whatever. And we had the pleasure of having the author Violet LeMay come into the store and read her new picture book. I got to meet her and talk to her, and she was so lovely to talk to. Of course, after I met her and talked to her for a little bit, I picked up her picture book, and it is Alia Ramirez was an artist. And Alia Ramirez happened to be a little girl who lived in Texas, and she was one of the many victims of the Uvalde, Texas school shooting that happened in, I believe, May of 2022. And the inspiration behind this for Violet was that she was watching a show, and someone during the interview, I think with her parents, said Alithia was an artist. And so she wrote and illustrated this book, and it was written to honor all the victims of the Uvalde school shooting. And it's a beautiful little book. It includes some of Alithia's actual art, which I thought was absolutely lovely. The illustrations are somewhat simplistic, but they're beautiful and super colorful because that's how Alithia drew her art, was with a lot of color, and her joy kind of came through, and she was just a very colorful little girl. So yeah, I was happy to add this to my little collection, and I wanted to talk to more people about it because I just thought it was a good story to share, even though it is based in tragedy. The next book I read was Black Mouth by Ronald Maly. This was my first Ronald Maly, and I'm here to tell you that it will not be my last. This was a horror novel. If you read the synopsis, you will see a striking resemblance to Stephen King's It, if you're familiar with Stephen King. But this story really has its own merit. It stands alone as its own really, really good story. And as much as I love Stephen King, and as much as I love It particularly, the similarities between the two are very, very surface level. So the title, Black Mouth, it refers to an area on the outskirts of the town where all the characters were born and raised. And I can't remember the name of the town, but Black Mouth refers to that outer part where it used to be a coal mine, and years or decades ago, it collapsed. It was a tragedy that the town never forgot. And from that tragedy, some strange goings-on started happening that have kind of always haunted the town. Now, the main characters that you're following are Jamie, who narrates the story, and his best friends, Mia and Clay. And then Jamie also has I can't remember if he's older or younger, but he's developmentally disabled. As the story opens up, they're all grown adults, and they've all kind of gone their separate ways, living in separate parts of the country. And Jamie himself is kind of going nowhere in life. He struggles with addiction. He's been in and out of rehab. He's called home because the local law enforcement found Jamie's brother Dennis walking naked down the road. And once they brought Dennis home, they discovered that their mother was upstairs dead, and she had been dead for a week. So Jamie goes home to make arrangements to bury his mom, and then to find out what he's going to do with Dennis. Once Jamie gets home, creepy stuff starts happening, bad stuff starts happening, and circumstances lead his two childhood friends to come home and help them face not only what's happening in the present day, but to find out how it's related to the really bad things that happened to them when they were kids. So there is a dual timeline here that is very, very interesting. And the story itself about what the bad thing is and why it's happening, I was completely compelled by who the bad guy is and how he did his evil. I thought was very unique for a horror story. I loved the coming of age portion of this book. One of the things that I felt made this book a standout was you had these three friends, right? And they had this kind of collective bad thing happen to them by the same external evil. But not only that, but they each individually had bad things happening to them in their home lives. You had Jamie, who had a very abusive father. You have Clay, who not only is he dealing with the difficulty of living in a southern town, being basically the only Black family in this town. As if that wasn't difficult enough, he was dealing with vitiligo, which he got incredibly bullied for. And then you have Mia, who was orphaned as a child, and she's living with her, if nothing else, apathetic uncle. So you have all of those circumstances going on, and then evil comes to town and wreaks its havoc. And then when they grow up, you have Jamie, who unfortunately wasn't able to deal with all of the bad stuff, and he ends up struggling with addiction. But you have Mia, who grows up and she channels the bad stuff into a creativity, and she becomes kind of a movie producer, and she's fairly successful at it. And then you have Clay, who channels all the bad stuff into helping other people in social work. And I really liked that aspect of the story because you're also following another character, Wayne, I think is his name. And he had bad stuff, really, really, really bad stuff happen to him as a child. But instead of growing up to do good with that, he ends up growing up to be a monster himself. And there's that whole kind of subplot that happens, and that is super terrifying and just page turning. But there's just so much more to this story than it just being a horror novel that just made it super compelling and super interesting and just a really good read. I've been wanting to read Malfi's work for a while, and it was just pure luck that I got to read it in October. It was perfect. It was terrifying. It was very well narrated. So if you're into audiobooks and you want a good scary read, I highly recommend Black Mouth by Ronald Maly. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Okay, let's get down to my 3 favorite books that I read in the month of October. Starting with Still Life by Louise Penny. This was my first Louise Penny, and it won't be my last. Still Life is the first in a series, and I want to say there are 19 books in the series so far, so I'm super excited to move on with that series. I absolutely love this book, way more than I expected to. I thought it was going to be kind of a cozy mystery and not really for me, and the whole reason I read it was it's the book club selection for my It's a Mystery book club that I do through work. This takes place in Canada, and you're following Chief Inspector Armand Gamache. He is called to the small town, the small village, I guess you would say, of Three Pines to investigate a murder of an elderly woman who was supposedly liked by everybody in the village. Her name was Jane. She's found in the woods with an arrow hole going through her. The arrow's missing. At first, actually, it's even unclear if it is a murder. For a while, they think it might be a hunting accident, but they still need to find out who fired the arrow. So what made this so much fun to read was the characters involved. I loved Gamache as a character, and I'm so looking forward to following him through the next however many books. He had in this story a kind of a detective trainee. I think her name was Yvette Nicole, who was a terrible trainee, and he's trying to give her chance after chance to be a better detective. And so there was a conflict between Gamache and Nicole. And then you have different characters of the people who live in this village, and they're all very colorful in their own right. You have the couple, Clara and Peter, who are artists, one of whom is successful, the other not so much. You have Myrna, I believe is her name, and she's a former psychologist who has opened a bookshop. You have Gabri and Oliver, who are a gay couple who run a bistro, and you have an sundry of other characters who are fun to get to know. I wasn't confused by all the characters. They're all very well developed. I can't remember their first names, but they're the Crofts, and they are known to be archers, you know, bow and arrow hunters, and their son has been accused of committing a hate crime against Gabri and Oliver. So there's these several subplots that are going on, and you're wondering how it's related to the murder. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. To be fair, it did start off a little bit slowly, and I think that's by design because it is the first in a series, so you're really getting to know characters, because from what I understand, multiple books happen just in this village. So not only does Armand Gamache and his partners in law enforcement reappear in future books, but a lot of the villagers do as well. This particular mystery, the art world has a lot to do with it, because there is an art type of event that happens, and Jane was a part of this event, and something kind of substantial happens with Jane's art. And so you're wondering how that plays into the mystery. And it was all very fascinating to me. I loved this mystery. I loved the characters. I was reminded yet again the beauty of book clubs, where you are assigned, for lack of a better term, a book to read that you might not normally pick up. And I'm so glad I read this book, and I'm so anxious to read the next one in the series. I've already put it on hold on my Libby apps. But yes, I highly recommend Still Life. Okay, so finally, the two physical books that I picked from my stack of spooky books that I pulled from my shelves that I got to. One is an ARC, and the other has been on my shelf for a couple of years now. And I've mentioned in previous videos, and several of you have said, please, please read it. The first book I'll talk about is The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. I was very excited to read it and very excited to get my hands on an ARC. I've never read this author before. It's not going to be my last by her. She did an exceptional job with this story. So this story is drawn from true events that happened at a school called the Dozier School for Boys in Florida. And it turns out that the author discovered that an uncle or a great uncle of hers was one of the victims from that school. I am glad that I read it. This was very difficult to read at times, but she did just such a good job of creating a unique story that surrounded the events that happened at this school. So in this story, you're following Robert Stevens Jr. He is an 11-year-old boy. It's in Florida, 1950, and he's living with his sister, who is a few years, I want to say she's 15 or 16 years old. They're living by themselves. One day they're walking home from school, and the son of one of the biggest landowners in town starts to make untoward advances towards Gloria. And Robert steps forward to kind of protect her, and he ends up kicking this kid. And for kicking this kid, and who this kid happens to be in town, that gets Robert sent to the Gracetown School for Boys for a period of 6 months. The reason Gloria and Robert live by themselves is their mother has died, and their father, who is very outspoken in town about unionizing the mill workers, and the fact that he is Black and it's the South and it's the 1950s, he has to leave town in a hurry to save his life, really. He's trying to establish himself enough in order to send for his kids. Now, everybody in the town knows who Robert Stevens Sr. is, and Robert Stevens Jr. gets punished really by proxy because nobody can find his dad. The thing about Robert is, and like several kids in town that people are aware of, Robert can see ghosts and talk to ghosts. And as soon as he gets to the school, he can feel that something terrible happened at the school. Before long, the warden finds out that Robert can see ghosts and decides to assign Robert as a haint catcher. They refer to ghosts as haints. I had never heard of ghosts referred to as haints before, and I asked my husband, I'm like, have you ever heard of a haint? And he's like a ghost? And I said, yeah. And I guess it's a Southern thing. Robert is enlisted by the warden to catch haints because evidently the warden is being haunted by a haint, and it's making his life absolutely hell, and he feels like the haint is going to lead him to have certain secrets revealed, and once the secrets are revealed, then the school will be closed. So the warden is highly motivated to catch all the haints that are at the school. The problem is that all of the ghosts that are haunting the school know what kind of person the warden is. And so Robert is conflicted because he also knows what kind of person the warden is. One of the things that I appreciated about the way this story was written is that, yes, many, many bad things, terrible things happen to these boys at the school. Some of it's on the page, but a lot of it's not. And you know and understand what happens, but I appreciate that a lot of it wasn't on the page. If you're a really, really good writer, it doesn't really need to be, and it could still be equally terrifying, and it still gets the point across that something terrible has happened. There is an incredible twist that happens about, I don't know, halfway, maybe a third through the book that I so appreciated. Did not see it coming. The writing is so vivid that it was like running a movie in my head. It's mostly from Robert's point of view, but you do alternate from Robert to his sister Gloria, because Gloria is on the outside doing everything that she can to free Robert, and that's almost as compelling as Robert's story. This was just a very, very compelling read. I couldn't put it down, and I just loved that the author put this story out there. It needs to be told. So yeah, this book just came out on Halloween Day, October 31st. I will never forget Robert Stevens Jr. He's one of those characters that is unforgettable, and I loved him, and I loved the story, and I loved the writing, and I'm really looking forward to getting to her other works. So yes, The Reformatory, highly recommend. And finally, my favorite book of the month. Like, how can I get much better than The Reformatory? I thought that was going to be my favorite of the month, but then the other behemoth that I read, you guys, there were a few of you out there who have been trying to get me to read this for the longest time, and I have been trying to get to it for the longest time, but because of what a brick it is, it was so intimidating because you know how I feel about long books. I finally read, you guys, Swan Song by Robert McGammon. I loved this book so much, and I was so glad I read it. So it's funny that I read 2 books in the month of October that have a synopsis that are very similar to a Stephen King book. So much like Black Mouth is very similar to Stephen King's It, this one has been often compared to Stephen King's The Stand. Very, very similar premise. So with The Stand, you're dealing with, I think, a virus or an illness that kills off the majority of the population on the planet. With this one, you're dealing with World War III, and the Russians nuke us, and we nuke the Russians, and the planet is just decimated, but there are pockets of survivors. It follows 3 groups of characters as they are making their way across the country trying to survive. And you meet a bunch of other characters along the way, but you're mainly following Colonel Macklin and Roland, who were part of this place called the Earth House in the mountains of Idaho. And it was a place that was kind of set up underneath this mountain. It's kind of a bunker that people can go and get off the grid for a couple of weeks. And when the nuclear holocaust happens, the mountain collapses on Earth House. Roland and the Colonel are the sole survivors. Then you have Sister in New York. When you first meet her, she's a homeless woman on the street, and she's homeless because of a tragedy that happened early on, and she is rejected by her family, and she kind of loses her mind a little bit, but she survives the nuclear holocaust, and she finds this mysterious glass ring in the rubble, and it has certain magical powers when Sister holds it, and she can kind of see the future, and she can kind of see other people that she feels she's supposed to meet. And she's starting to travel across the country looking for these people. Then you're following Joshua, and he is a professional wrestler. He is traveling to his next wrestling venue when it hits, and he finds himself at this gas station, and a mother and her 9-year-old daughter, Swan, at this gas station at the same time when the nuclear holocaust hits, and they are traveling together, and Joshua is told by the gas station attendant before he kicks the bucket to protect the child. And the story all kind of goes from there. There are many other characters that you meet along the way, and there's good people and there's bad people. Ultimately, this comes down to all of these storylines connecting together, and it's good versus evil and who's going to prevail. But there's just so much more in this book. When I wasn't reading this book, I was thinking about all the characters in this book. I could not put it down, but at the same time, I was afraid to read further along because I was afraid that like one of my favorite characters would die, because characters died left and right. After finishing the book, I haven't stopped thinking about the characters. I miss them. They're my friends. The thing about this book is it was so realistic. I believe this book came out in 1987, and it's so ahead of its time as far as what could happen or what would happen if, you know, they push that big red button. I think of all the time. I have thought about all the time, probably since watching The Walking Dead years ago. I think about what would I do? How would I react? How would I go about surviving if something happens, some kind of Armageddon, some kind of fallout where there are exponentially fewer people on the planet and there's no running water and there's no power, electricity, or anything like that. I often wonder about that. And this just re-sparked that line of thinking for me. And it's just so realistic, and it's terrifying in that way of how realistic it is. I love this book so much because it's not just a horror and it's not just a survival. It's about human connection and people taking care of each other and starting anew and hope. He did such a fantastic job with this book. Thank you for constantly encouraging me to read it because I absolutely loved it. You could probably guarantee that this book is going to be on my favorites for the year. I'm not even taking away for the fact that it's almost 1,000 pages long because I couldn't get enough of this book. It could have been another 500 pages and I probably still would have enjoyed it. If I were still giving out stars, all of them, all of the stars for this one. Absolutely loved it. Oh my gosh, I felt like a really long ramble. Hopefully I'll be able to edit this down to a reasonable length of time. But if I don't, I hope you enjoyed the video anyways. Those are the books that I read in October. I thought it was a really fantastic reading month and I'm so happy to share it with you. What books did you guys read in October? Have you read any of these books? What did you think about them? I would love to know. Or you can just say hi down in the doodly-doo. As always, thank you so much for watching. I so appreciate you being here. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be wonderful. I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.